Hi there guys, my name is Tim Perevozchikov and I'm really excited to be doing my third topic analysis for the Champion Brief's December topic analysis. So the topic we're going to be discussing today is resolved for-profit prisons in the United States should be banned. Before actually venturing into the topic analysis, in today's topic analysis we're going to mainly be discussing negative strategies, frameworks, and advocacies that will help it get out of a very difficult debate that's most certainly going to be had at tournaments. Additionally, we'll be focusing on affirmative strategies rather than argumentations. If you'd like to see more on argumentations, I encourage you to go check out the Champion Brief's December brief. It's got a lot of diverse argumentation that's very unique and very well carded. So now that we've discussed what the tournaments are going to look like in the month of December, let's approach this topic. And I think it's really important on this topic, especially to have a strong historical understanding of how private prisons originated and how this became such a corporate conglomerate-run industry. So this all started back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration's war on drugs. So what ends up happening is that drug-related crimes skyrocket, and since the punishments for having these drugs are much more stringent, much higher than previously, the prison population increases immensely. So in 1984, the Correction Corporations of America, which is the largest prison corporation of any to date, absorbs a facility through a contract with Hamilton County, Tennessee. So this is the first time it's happened, 1984, so it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And second, and Zach and I discussed this much further in our topic analysis, I think it's really important to understand the prison industry in the United States today. Shockingly, the United States has the highest incarceration rate of any nation in the world, exceeding places like Iran, China, and even Russia. So our prison industry is enormous, and it makes sense that the private prison industry has grown as a result of this because there's been an increasing demand for these facilities and for contractors to run the operation. So with that historical understanding in mind, let's now turn to breaking down the topic itself and what the topic's sort of asking. So first and foremost, I'd like to point out that unlike the previous few months, this month's topic is asking a policy question, whether or not an action should be taken to remove something that exists in the status quo. So we're not just asking, on balance, is it good or bad? And Zach does a wonderful job of expanding on this, especially for the negative side, how that opens up an array of topics. So basically, the topic should be approached in the following way. If you were a US policymaker and you were evaluating the prison industry, would for-profit prisons be a good option? And recognize how that's important, right? So if we were to abolish private prisons and the system would collapse or have costly inefficiencies that would exceed the benefits of eliminating the for-profit prison, then we would say we shouldn't do it. So this offers the negative an enormous ground that they can use to manipulate and framework to open up a lot of opportunities for late-round strategic considerations. So now that we have that in mind, let's discuss what the affirmative strategies and frameworks exist for this month and which ones will yield the biggest benefit for debaters. So there are a few strategies that Zach and I think ultimately can be chosen, and the benefits and costs you guys can weigh, that will get you the most ground in the debate. So the first is the obvious cost benefit, right? So you can set up the debate to say, hey, look, the round is about which side is better, whether regular prisons are better or for-profit prisons are better, and then highlight the host of economic, social, and moral harms that come along with having for-profit prisons. This is the most straightforward framework, it is the most intuitive framework, and it will probably be the most commonly run one on the topic. However, if you want to get a little bit more nuanced, there exists a number of frameworks and strategies that can be combined in order to form a very cohesive, compelling narrative. So the first one I'll break down is that of moral claims, right? So you set up the framework in a way that claims that the United States as a government has to control for the just treatment of its inmates, for the rehabilitation of its inmates, for fair retribution of justice, and for overall a healthy functioning system. So if you set up the round in that way, you can talk about how the for-profit prison industry undermines each and every one of these. So first, on the idea of rehabilitating prisoners, recognize for-profit prisons only work when prisons are full. As a result, it makes sense and a logical argument and empirical literature exists to suggest that for-profit prisons have an incentive not to help their inmates when they get out of prison, they want them to reincarcerate themselves, recommit a crime, and be put back in jail. The second reason why they fail those is the unjust treatment of its prisoners. So for-profit prisons have been documented instances of paying very, very cheap, far below minimum wage rates for very demanding labor, up to 25 cents an hour, which is just extraordinary and very exploitive. And secondly, there's a lot of discussion about how in for-profit prisons, there's a lot more inmate abuse, there's a lot more violence. There were some documented cases of prisoners being told that they were in a gladiator arena and that they could only fight to the death to survive in the for-profit prison. Clearly, this is not something that the United States government should be including. And third, we can talk about how it doesn't pass from an efficient retributive point of justice either, right? So if we think of what the prison system is set up to do from a moral standpoint, it is to redole out justice to those who have committed a crime and make sure that they can reintegrate back into society without again committing a further crime. So, as such, for-profit prisons clearly undermine this because not only do they set up contracts that say, hey, we require that 80% of our jails be full at all time, no matter what the crime rate is at the time, but secondly, they can influence legislative decisions because they are a very strong lobbyist voice that pushes for creation of laws such as mandatory minimums and other draconian punishments that are then used to fill up their jail cells. So, why is this strategy a good idea for affirmatives? We think it's a very strong, compelling narrative, right? Like, at the end of the day, hearing about the harsh abuse that occurs within the prison industry, hearing about how ineffective it is at rehabilitating these criminals back into society and giving them a second chance is a very compelling argument and a very compelling strategy. So, but what are the downsides? The downsides is that you're only binding yourself in a moral consideration rather than including the idea of utilitarian harms. If you include utilitarian harms in the case, we believe some healthy, harmonious blend of the two frameworks will probably be strongest because you get both advantages. So with that, I'll turn to the last framework that I'll be discussing in today's topic analysis. So in this framework, it should be all about what is more fair. And it's not the same as being what is more moral, but rather what is more fair. So we have to ask ourselves, in for-profit prisons, with the extremely high turnover rates of security guards, with the dissolution of local economies as a result of their creation, with actually arguments about a lot of inefficiencies with our for-profit prisons, is it really a good idea to be contracting out these facilities to these corporations? And the overwhelming answer seems to be no, it doesn't seem to be working, and policymakers are reconsidering it. However, it's really important on the affirmative to consider, when pressed, what is the alternative to for-profit prisons. You have to have a good answer and a good explanation as to why your alternative is actually feasible. So you can't just say, oh, we'll just run the facilities by the government, because one, that it requires an increase in the government budget that, with a conservative House and a conservative Senate, doesn't seem to necessarily be coming, but certainly is within the realm of possibility. You just have to make warrants and arguments. And secondly, we think that if you are able to combine both a compelling alternative with one of the three frameworks I mentioned above, you're basically set, because overwhelmingly the literature is on your side. Now onto the negative strategy and framework considerations. And I really encourage you here at this point, if you really want in-depth argumentation, to look at the brief rather than the topic analysis, because we're going to focus on sort of bigger picture strategy in the next 6 or 7 upcoming minutes. So where do we first dive in? Let's first dive in with the most intuitive framework and the probably most stock one on the topic. That is, as the negative, if you can prove that on balance they are good, being private prisons are beneficial for society, then clearly we shouldn't ban them. So this gives you the benefit of a very clear standard, creates a lot of clash in the debate, but unfortunately you'll probably have a little bit of a difficult time making the case that on balance they're good, because most literature says they're not on balance good. Under this sort of framework, some strategies you can consider are arguing about how the government has an obligation to effectively run the Justice Department in an efficient manner, and as such, turning to private prisons eliminates a lot of the inefficiencies that are inherent to bureaucratic red tape and bureaucratic institutions. So basically, by privatizing the industry, we've made a more efficient, cost-effective prison system for society. So that's the most intuitive sort of argument, and the most probably stock argument on the topic. So what do you as the negative have to do to overcome the strategic gap that you're at? Well, we believe there are a number of things that you should be highlighting about the wording of the resolution to make it abundantly clear that you do not have to prove that on balance they are good. So the first and most important thing to observe or run an argument about, this is how you choose to do it in case, but it's really important to make clear that government-run prisons suffer from almost all, if not most, of the problems that the affirmative highlights with for-profit prisons. You talk about prisoner abuse, it occurs in public-run prisons as well. You talk about inefficiencies, it occurs in public-run prisons. Public-run prisons don't have a tremendous record of rehabilitation rates. They don't have a tremendous record in non-abusive prisoners or paying their employees well. So at the end of the day, a lot of the harms the affirmative argues are non-unique to the debate round. Or, if they are unique, basically what the affirmative is saying is, let's eliminate for-profit prisons and just let these people go back on the street. I don't think it's a good idea necessarily to just let millions of individuals who are currently in prison without any sort of rehabilitation back into society. I think that's sort of perpetuating the problem rather than actually alleviating it. That being said, the second thing you should be doing under this sort of analysis in most rounds is making it clear that the affirmative has to show you an alternative, right? So basically, if we're going to be eliminating for-profit prisons, there's not just going to be a vacuum of security. It's either going to be replaced by government-run prisons or by some new alternative method. The point being that if you can highlight all of the harms of that and do comparative analysis rather than just a vacuum set analysis of private prisons, there's a lot more ground and argumentation you can go for. So third, we'd like to observe, and Zach does a wonderful job talking about this in the topic analysis, that just because a policy is bad does not mean that we should abolish it, right? Like a lot of government policies, if not almost all of them, come with certain inefficiencies or certain problems. The reason why we simply don't eliminate them is because we see the possibility of reform, we see the policy of adaptation, and we see evolution within our policy. And the reason why that's important is because even if they can highlight specific problems about the private prison industry today, that doesn't mean we should put a blanket ban on it everywhere, right? So like, for example, if the United States, say 2 years from now, has a massive increase in the amount of, say, gang-related crime in America, and that causes the prison industry to expand like 50%. There's no way that the government would be able, through its current budgetary measures, to make up for that windfall. So what would they have to do? Well, if there's no alternative to fill that gap, then basically the United States Justice Department just collapsed onto itself. So basically we need for-profit prisons for that sort of scenario. So putting a blanket ban is not good. The other argument you should be making, and this is sort of inherent to for-profit prisons in general, is that they have to meet industry standards, right? So it's not just some like little bundled off corporation that never gets checked on and is completely autonomous from the United States government. Regularly, U.S. inspectors come in to inspect the standard of the prison, to ensure that prisoners aren't being abused, to ensure that people are going to be meeting the rehabilitation standards, and most importantly, remember this is corporate America. So if your corporation is continuing providing very high recidivism rates, if your prisons are constantly filling themselves up as a result of you being negligent to your prisoners, you will not win the next contract. This is a capitalist 101 argument, and the premise is that competition will push you out. People will hire better security guards, people will make sure that their standards meet the industry, and overall the system will correct itself. This is sort of a fundamental capitalist argument there. And so finally, what else can you do on the negative? Well, on the negative, I think that there are a lot of arguments to be made about the fact that private prisons also can be more just if operated in the right way, right? So we're not saying that everywhere, and this is an important observation for the negative. The resolution does not say, oh, we should just eliminate 50% of for-profit prisons. It's saying we should eliminate all of them. So that inherently is going to abolish a lot of the well-run, very efficient prisons along with the inefficient ones. That's not a clear strategy, right? So like, for example, you could make the case on the negative that you should do policy reform, where instead of having, say, 50,000 private prisons in the United States, that's an overestimate, you should say have 20,000 and only operate the most 20,000 efficient. Now, the affirmative is most likely to call you out on abuse and say, hey, you can't just pick the good ones to defend. But then the question becomes, if some of them are good and some of them are bad, that means that for-profit prisons are not inherently bad, because exists an avenue for them to be successful. I think the best negative cases will have examples of very efficient very high quality, very well standard private prisons that have low rates of recidivism, that are very good to prisoners, and there are examples out there in the literature. You just have to look hard enough, and that's why we really encourage you to get a head start. Finally, we encourage you to run sort of a diversity of argumentation, right? So while you certainly want to hedge your bets with the observations I talked about, and you do want to mention, of course, the efficiency argument, it's important to sort of try to diversify your base. So if you look through the December Champions Brief's negative argumentation, there are 8 or 9 arguments that are really unique, that aren't intuitive, that are going to be necessary, especially later on in the month when you're starting to debate the topic for the second, the third, or even the fourth time, in order to win those close rounds against very good competition. So I wish you the best of luck going forward. For more topic analyses and for more general analysis, I encourage you to check out the December Champion Brief's December Brief. Have a good one.